Hello everyone, I'm Mrs. Darby and this is the Art of Teaching Art. Today I'm going to show you how to use black and white acrylic paint, some different techniques and ways of working with the material. So this is an example page that I have made to explore different ways of working with acrylic paint. We're starting with black and white because then we don't have to worry too much about colour mixing. We're just focusing on the skills of blending, mixing different tones, and then some different techniques that you can use with the materials, as well as working on different surfaces. So the things that you will need is a jar of water or mug of water. I've got a china plate with black and white acrylic, and you might want a selection of brushes, but I'm going to be using this mid-sized brush. You might also want some tissue as well. So I have a piece of cartridge paper, it's just a plain piece of paper, and I've already attached some different surfaces at the bottom. And my first step is to mix some different tones. So with this, I'm aiming to mix a few different tones using the black and white. Now I'm going to start with the white and add in the black paint to make it darker. So it starts lighter on this side and then darker going that way. So we scoop a little bit of white first of all to start off our paint, and then a tiny little dab of the black paint just to make it a little bit darker. So I've got a grey just there, and then we just apply it to the paper. Then we repeat the process, another little dab of black. And record all the way along to the darkest tones. So when I'm mixing, I mix in just a small area. I twirl the brush to try and keep all of the bristles together. And you may need to add a little touch of water. Mine seems fine, these are fairly new paints, but you may want to add a little bit more. So there we are, our different tones. So the next thing is to move on to learning about blending, and there's a few different techniques for this. So the first technique is adding in the next colour. So I'm just going to zoom in the camera so you can see more closely. So for this, I start with the darker colour and then I add in the lighter colour, but you do need to work fairly quickly because the paint dries fairly quickly. So I'm starting with this darkest colour. I'm going to add a little bit of water to just make sure it's fluid enough. So starting with the darker colour, I'm going to remove some of the paint from my brush by just twirling it on the palette. I'm going to then dab into the white and work on top. So that's wet on wet paint together and moving across. A little bit more white. Working on top again. You can see I'm not washing my brush in between. I'm using very soft feathery brush marks to blend. I'm just adding a little bit more white each time. Washing the brush now. I'm going to dab off the extra water on the tissue, and then just with a damp brush, very lightly, just going over the top to improve that blend. And add a little bit more white at the end. Now I've got a clean brush, and then working softly to move upwards. So it's all about adding the next colour, but using the brush with different pressure to blend it. The next one is to mix the colours beforehand and then layer them next to each other. So you want kind of 3 or 4 different tones. going to start with the white this time, so just using the tip of my brush. Then I'll dip into the lighter grey, overlap the bit that I've just painted and paint a little bit more. Now dip back into the white just with the tip of my brush, and I'll go over to create that blend in the middle while the paint is still wet. So it's all about dipping back into the previous colour and then into the next colour, overlapping them to create your blends. So overlapping, moving to the next one. And again, I'm not washing my brush in between. If you do find you've got a little bit too much paint on your brush, you can dab it off on the tissue. And again, you may want to wash your brush and go back over very softly with a damp brush to just finalise those blends. The final technique uses those same tones, but with more obvious brush marks. So I'm going to start with the black over this side. So I'm working in a diagonal fashion with the brush marks and then dipping into the grey, working over the top, dipping into the next grey, working over the top. So just a slightly different way of working if you do want a more visible brush stroke. Then we've got some different techniques. So firstly, blocking in. So a little bit of water in with the paint. You can choose any tone for this. And it's simply painting a shape to block in. So you might use this when you're starting a painting to cover a specific area. Try to go in one direction if you want to minimise brush marks. But it's just filling a section with colour, basically, blocking in. The next one is sharp edges. Now, sometimes you might want to have a neat or detailed edge. You need to make sure that for this, your brush is all together, like this. And you want to add a little bit of water or acrylic medium with the paint to make it smooth and more fluid. So I'm going to use that same colour again, a little bit of water. And I want to have a sharp edge so I can see all my brush is together. And I'm just going to paint with the tip of the brush to get a nice sharp edge. So you can do a wider mark, but you can see the water helps you to add a nice sharp edge. Now, if you do find that your edge isn't as sharp as you want it, you can go back over and just smooth it out using the tip of the brush, changing the angle that you're painting at to get nice sharp edges. The next one is wet paint over dry or glazing, and again paint a block. I just need to leave that to dry before I do the next step, but we'll move on to the next bit, which is scumbling, and that is using your brush in a circular motion. Could be used for blending, but it is also used for texture. This is one where you want probably a little bit less water on your brush. I'm just going to dry off my brush a little bit on the paper towel, and I'm going to start with a darker paint in a circular motion. I'm not pressing hard with the paintbrush, but you can see the dry marks that it's creating, and you can layer tones in this way as well. So we're going to move on to the next bit, which is mark making. So thinking about what can this brush do. So this is a round brush, but it might be this is where you try out a square brush or a longer brush like this, which is a rigger brush, but they all make different marks. And you could, if you're exploring painting a bit further, explore other items to make marks as well, like palette knives, combs, bamboo, sticks, all of those type of things. So seeing what kind of marks this can make. So just gonna load up with paint again. So it can make thin marks. If I press the brush down, make thicker marks. We dry off the paint a little bit. Drier marks. I just dab the brush, make circular marks. Obviously you can fill in an area. See what thin marks I can make just with the tip of the brush. So all the time you are developing your paintbrush control, you're developing your knowledge of the material by simply using it to see what it can do. So you can see I've mixed a little bit more paint and water in with that. I wonder what would happen if I could do some cross hatchings, do some different types of marks that way as well. And then potentially working with a different brush, so the square brush, thicker marks, more painterly marks. So you're trying out and seeing what marks you can make with the different brushes. If I got a smaller brush, smaller and shorter, mix a little bit of water. So you're thinking about the smallest marks you can make, the largest marks you can make, what happens if you move the brush in a curve, what happens if you dab the brush, all those type of things to try out different ways of working. So the next bit is dry brushing. So often this is nice to add texture. So with dry brushing, you want to have a colour prepared. You want to completely dry your brush. Okay, and the idea is you dab the paint on the palette, but then dab it into the space. So I'm going to dab it on the palette. This might still be a little bit wet. And then dab it in. Yeah, it is a little bit wet. Let me get another new brush. Right, a completely dry brush now. So dabbing onto the paint and then onto the paper, so you can see the marks that are being created there. A little bit more paint. So I'm dabbing into the paint and then dabbing onto the palette, then into the space. And you can think about as well with this is having a really dry brush with hardly any water and this type of mark as well. So let's go back and paint on top of this. So wet paint over dry paint, and I'm just going to work over that. So you can see that acrylic basically fully covers the colour that is before. Now that is only the case with some colours. Some are transparent. It's all according to what brand, what colour it is, but generally the paint covers what is before. So it means if you make a mistake, you can work on top to cover it up. You can put down base layers and then work over the top of them. You can try doing some of the mark making that we tried below, but on a slightly different surface. You'll find it different painting on a different surface as well. But you can build up the layers with the paint. So the final section is working on these different surfaces. Now, you might paint on normal paper, like we have been. You might paint on a different surface that's already been painted with gesso or a layer of acrylic, but it's also nice to explore painting on some different surfaces. So I've got newspaper here that you could add as collage, black card, brown paper, and then corrugated card. So the one that looks like that. And I'm just going to paint a shape over the top of it. I'm going to go for a part of a circle to just explore what it's like to paint over the top of that. Do I need to change the pressure that I'm adding? Do I need to put more water with it? And this might also be a chance for you to experiment with your blending to practice those skills as well. And then try on to the other materials as well. And there we have it, a page exploring some different techniques with acrylic paint with black and white. Thank you so much for watching and have a really great day.